The nurse thought the puppy was begging for food. That's what everyone assumed. But when she followed him behind the hospital, her body went cold. She understood the truth too late, because the puppy wasn't asking for help. He was standing guard over a woman who was already dying, less than 50 feet from the emergency room, doctors, alarms, and help that never came. And she had been invisible the entire time, and no one had listened. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe, and really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Late morning light spilled across the front of the city hospital, bright but strangely cold. The sun hung high enough to suggest energy and movement, yet the air around the building felt tired, weighed down by everything that passed through its doors. Ambulances came and went in steady rhythm. Visitors moved in and out with coffee cups, paperwork, and quiet worry etched on their faces. The hospital never truly rested, even in daylight. It only changed pace. Emily Carter stepped outside, just after her shift officially ended, though the concept of time had blurred for her hours ago. She had worked straight through the morning, moving from one emergency to the next without pause. Daylight streaming through windows inside the ER had done nothing to ease the pressure. If anything, it made the exhaustion sharper, harder to ignore. Her body felt heavy, her thoughts muted, her emotions dulled by necessity rather than choice. She stood near the entrance for a moment, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, blinking against the brightness. The sounds of the city were alive now. Cars passed steadily. A helicopter thudded faintly somewhere overhead. Voices overlapped near the curb where patients were being dropped off. Emily took a slow breath, letting the warmth of the sun touch her face without really feeling it. She was running on routine, nothing more. The glass doors slid shut behind her, sealing off the controlled chaos she had lived in for hours. Outside, everything looked normal, too normal. Emily started toward the sidewalk, her steps automatic, her mind already drifting toward the drive home and the silence she craved. That was when she heard it. The sound cut through the daytime noise in a way that made her pause mid-step. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. A thin, wavering cry rose above traffic and conversation, carrying an urgency that didn't match its size. Emily frowned, listening. The cry came again, clearer now, unmistakably animal, a puppy young, small. The sound wasn't frantic or panicked. It was steady, deliberate, as if repeated with intention. Emily glanced around briefly. People continued moving past the entrance without slowing. A security guard stood near the doors, focused on his screen. A couple walked by, deep in conversation. No one reacted. The cry continued unchanged, threading itself between footsteps and engine noise. She told herself not to get involved. Daytime or not, the rules didn't change. Hospitals weren't places for stray animals, and she had already given everything she had for the day. Nursing had taught her how to compartmentalize suffering, how to draw lines to survive. Without those lines, the job would consume her entirely. She resumed walking, forcing herself not to look back. The cry followed her, not physically, she realized, but mentally. It stayed with her, repeating in her thoughts with quiet persistence. It didn't fade as she put distance between herself and the entrance. It didn't blend into the background noise the way it should have. Emily clenched her jaw, irritation mixing with guilt. She had heard cries like this before, not always from animals. Sometimes they came from people who needed more than she could give. She had learned when to keep moving. She reached the edge of the sidewalk and stopped, pretending to check her phone. The sound came again, exactly the same. It had not grown louder. It had not weakened. It waited. Emily lifted her gaze, scanning the area near the hospital entrance and the surrounding corners. Sunlight cast sharp shadows along the building's exterior. There were plenty of places something small could be overlooked in plain sight. The cry drifted from somewhere close, somewhere people passed without noticing. Her chest tightened. In the emergency room, sounds escalated quickly. Alarms blared, voices rose. Cries turned into chaos until someone intervened. This sound did none of that. It held steady, as if certain someone would eventually respond. That certainty unsettled her more than desperation ever could. She took another step toward the parking lot, determined to ignore it. The cry came again, sharper this time, not louder, but more focused. Emily stopped completely. The sunlight felt suddenly irrelevant. The world around her blurred as understanding settled in. The sound wasn't random, it wasn't a background nuisance. It wasn't asking for food or attention. It was calling. And it was waiting for her. Emily turned slowly back toward the hospital entrance, her exhaustion momentarily overridden by something she hadn't felt all day: purpose. Somewhere nearby, unseen by everyone else, the cry continued with patient resolve. And in that moment, standing in full daylight with people all around, Emily realized that if she walked away now, the sound would follow her far longer than the length of the sidewalk. Emily stood where she was, sunlight warming her arms while her mind drifted somewhere colder. The cry lingered behind her like an unfinished thought, pulling at memories she preferred to keep buried. Compassion fatigue was not something they taught in textbooks, yet she knew it intimately. It settled in slowly over years of practice, built from moments when caring too much became dangerous. To survive, she had learned to feel less, to move efficiently through pain without letting it take root. That skill had kept her standing through countless shifts, but it had also hollowed something out. Faces rose uninvited in her mind as she hesitated. Patients she had fought for and lost returned in fragments, never whole, always sharp. A man whose heart never restarted despite perfect timing. A child whose breathing slowed while she counted seconds that never came back. Families who searched her eyes for answers she could not give. Each memory carried the same lesson. You cannot save everyone. You cannot stop for every cry. Emily reminded herself of that truth as if repetition might strengthen it. Hospital policy echoed in her thoughts, rigid and familiar. Staff were discouraged from engaging with situations outside the building. Liability, safety, boundaries. She had signed forms acknowledging those rules more times than she could count. Breaking them rarely ended well, even when intentions were good. She pictured the consequences easily. Reports, questions, administrative meetings that drained energy she barely had. Her body felt heavy with the thought alone. She turned slowly, intending only to locate the source of the sound so she could alert someone else. That was the compromise she offered herself. When she saw the puppy clearly for the first time, the plan faltered. He stood several feet away near the edge of the walkway, small and trembling, his ribs faintly visible beneath dusty fur. His paws were splayed awkwardly, as if he had been standing too long without rest. Yet his eyes were sharp, fixed on her with a focus that felt startlingly human. He did not bark or whine when she looked at him. He did not lower his head or wag his tail. He simply held her gaze, as though measuring her. Emily felt an unexpected tightening in her chest. She had seen countless animals brought into the ER by well-meaning strangers. Fear usually dominated their movements. Hunger drove their behavior. This puppy showed neither. He seemed to be waiting for something specific. Emily shifted her weight, unsure what to do next. She half expected the puppy to retreat, but he didn't. Instead, he took a small step forward, positioning himself directly in her path. The movement was deliberate, careful, and oddly respectful. He was not demanding attention. He was blocking her. She inhaled slowly, the habit of control grounding her. This was exactly the kind of moment she should walk away from, she told herself. Getting involved would only complicate things. She glanced around, searching for staff or security, but the entrance area had thinned. The morning rush had moved inward, swallowed by hallways and elevators. The puppy's body shook, not with fear but with effort. It was as if standing there required everything he had. Emily noticed then how thin he was, how his coat dulled where it should have shined. Still, his focus never wavered. He looked past her briefly, then back again, repeating the motion with growing urgency. Emily followed his gaze without meaning to. Beyond the main entrance, a restricted service area ran along the side of the hospital, partially hidden by a concrete barrier. It was a place few people noticed, let alone visited. The puppy glanced toward it again, then returned his attention to Emily, his posture tense but controlled. The message was unspoken, yet unmistakable. He wanted her to see something. Emily felt irritation flare, quickly followed by unease. Animals didn't act like this without reason. Her training had taught her to trust patterns, to notice what didn't fit. This did not fit. The puppy wasn't asking for help for himself. He wasn't lost in the way she understood loss. He was anchored to that space, returning to it mentally even while standing in front of her. She hesitated longer than she meant to. The weight of exhaustion pressed down again, reminding her how much easier it would be to choose silence. To alert security, to let procedure take over. She took a half step back, testing her resolve. The puppy mirrored her movement instantly, maintaining the distance, maintaining the block. Emily swallowed, her heart beating faster now. The noise of the day seemed to dull around her, replaced by the steady awareness of the small body holding its ground. She realized with quiet shock that the puppy trusted her. Not because she had earned it, but because he needed her to act. Then, without warning, the puppy turned and ran. He darted toward the restricted area with sudden energy, stopping several yards away. He looked back once, eyes locked on Emily, his body poised and waiting. The space between them felt charged, stretched thin by choice. Emily stood frozen, the echo of the cry still ringing in her ears. The puppy did not move again. He simply waited, certain now that she would follow. Emily followed at a careful distance, every step measured, her instincts pulled in opposite directions. She told herself she was only making sure the puppy was safe, that she would stop once she understood what he wanted. Still, she couldn't ignore the way her pulse quickened as she moved farther from the familiar entrance and closer to the quieter side of the hospital. The sounds of traffic softened here, replaced by the low hum of ventilation systems and the distant echo of rolling carts inside the building. The puppy did not run like an animal in fear. His movement was controlled, purposeful, almost rehearsed. He would trot a few steps forward, then stop, turning his head just enough to check that Emily was still behind him. Each time their eyes met, he waited until she took another step before moving again. There was no frantic energy in him, no confusion. He seemed to know exactly where he was going. As Emily drew closer, details she hadn't noticed before came into focus. The puppy's fur was matted with dirt, dulled by days without rest. His breathing was shallow, uneven, the kind she had seen too many times in patients who had pushed themselves past exhaustion. Along one side of his coat, faint streaks of dried blood clung stubbornly to the fur. Emily crouched briefly, concern flaring, but she saw quickly that the blood wasn't his. There were no open wounds, no fresh injuries. Whatever had marked him belonged to someone else. The realization tightened her chest. This puppy hadn't wandered here by accident. He had been through something that required endurance rather than escape. She straightened slowly and continued after him, her earlier hesitation replaced by a growing sense of urgency she couldn't fully explain. They reached the edge of a service corridor that ran along the rear of the hospital, partially hidden from the main walkways. It was the kind of place people passed without noticing, designed to function rather than welcome. The puppy slowed, circling briefly before moving forward again. He returned to this spot twice, each time glancing back at Emily as if reinforcing its importance. Emily's thoughts raced, searching for context. Hospitals were full of overlooked spaces like this, corners meant for deliveries and waste removal, not for people or animals to linger. The air felt different here, cooler, heavier, carrying faint industrial smells beneath the familiar antiseptic. Emily's professional instincts stirred uneasily. She had learned to read environments as carefully as symptoms. Something about this place felt wrong. The puppy paused again, tail low, ears alert. He did not whine or bark. Instead, he stood still, body angled toward the corridor, eyes flicking between the shadowed entrance and Emily. The message was subtle but insistent. This was where he wanted her to look. Emily took another step forward, her heart beating louder in her ears now. She felt the weight of choice pressing down on her. Turning back was still an option. She could tell herself she had done enough, that someone else would handle whatever this was. Yet the longer she stood there, the more that excuse rang hollow. The puppy shifted, placing himself slightly ahead of her, as if assuming a position he believed was his to hold. That was when the thought settled fully in her mind. He wasn't guiding her for his own sake. He wasn't searching for food, warmth, or comfort. He was standing watch. Emily felt a chill despite the warmth of the day. The puppy's behavior mirrored something deeply familiar to her, something she had seen in people who refused to leave a bedside, who stayed awake through pain and fear because leaving felt unthinkable. Guardianship took many forms, she realized, and it didn't always look heroic. She scanned the corridor more carefully now, noticing scuffed concrete, faint marks that suggested something heavy had been moved recently. Her senses sharpened, the fatigue that had weighed on her moments ago giving way to focused alertness. The puppy remained still, unwavering, his small body tense with resolve. A sense of wrongness settled fully into place. Emily could not yet name it, could not see the shape of it clearly, but she knew without doubt that this puppy was not lost. He was anchored here by purpose. Whatever lay beyond that darkened corner mattered enough for him to stay, to wait, to call out until someone listened. The puppy took a final step forward and stopped completely at the deepest shadow near the rear entrance. He did not look back this time. He simply stood there, blocking the narrow space, refusing to move, as if guarding something unseen and waiting for Emily to be brave enough to see it too. Emily almost missed her. The hospital's outer path curved behind the ambulance bay, a narrow strip of cracked pavement no one used unless they were lost or looking for quiet. She had taken it for air, the kind that steadied shaking hands after a long shift. The puppy tugged the leash, nose low, tail stiff. Then he stopped. Not barked, not whimpered, stopped. Emily followed his stare to the shadow near the fence, where a body lay folded into itself, as if the ground had swallowed a person and forgotten to finish. She knelt before thinking. The woman was old, hair thin and silvered, skin pulled tight over bones. Her lips were cracked, her chest barely moved. Emily touched her wrist and felt nothing, then searched again, slower, steadier, until a faint flutter answered. Dehydration announced itself in every sign, the dull eyes, the dry tongue, the sunken cheeks. This wasn't sleep. This was a body running out of permission to keep going. Emily swallowed, the air suddenly sharp. The woman's breathing hitched, then stalled, then returned in shallow gasps. The puppy stepped forward and planted himself between them, small body rigid, ears angled back. It wasn't fear. It was loyalty sharpened into instinct. He glanced at Emily, then back at the woman, as if drawing a line that said not without me. Emily softened her voice, murmured nonsense meant for both of them. She showed her empty hands. The puppy didn't move, but his stance loosened, a fragile truce forming in the cold space. Emily understood someone had stayed. Someone had guarded. Even when no one else came, she assessed fast, the way training demanded, airway compromised, breathing shallow, circulation weak, skin tented when she pressed it. Severe dehydration, possibly days without water, hypothermia lurking in the shade despite the mild morning. Emily scanned for clues: no bag, no phone, no bracelet. The fence hummed softly with traffic on the other side. Sirens wailed close enough to mock her. Help was feet away, bright and busy, yet this corner remained invisible. The realization struck harder than the diagnosis. This place told a story without words. Weeds grew tall against the chain links, trash tucked into the grass like offerings. A maintenance door nearby wore a sign no one read. No footprints marked the dirt except the puppy's small prints circling, pacing. Emily imagined nights spent here, the woman curling tighter, the hospital lights glowing through gaps in the fence like promises that never crossed over. Neglect wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It settled in the spaces people stopped checking and waited. Emily felt the shock bloom in her chest, sharp and bitter. She had rushed past this path 100 times. Others had too. Stretchers rolled by, doors slid open and shut, lives traged and saved. And here, a woman faded quietly, within reach of everything she needed. Emily pressed her fingers to the woman's neck again, counting, recalculating, forcing her mind into calm. She spoke her name though she didn't know it, grounding herself with the act of naming the unknown. The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then stilled on Emily's face. A sound escaped her throat, not quite a word. Emily leaned close, careful not to crowd. She explained slowly, simply, what she was doing, where they were, that help was coming. The puppy nudged the woman's hand with his nose, a small insistence. The woman's fingers twitched, then curled weakly into his fur. Tears burned Emily's eyes, unwelcome and hot. Connection mattered. Even now, Emily reached for her radio, fingers trembling despite her resolve. She reported the situation, her voice steady because it had to be. She requested fluids, a gurney, immediate response. She knew the limits. Oral intake was risky. IV access would be difficult. Time was thinning. The woman's breath slowed again, pauses stretching longer. Emily counted, coaxed, adjusted her position to conserve heat. She felt the puppy's warmth against her knee, steadfast as a promise she hadn't made. As footsteps approached in the distance, Emily did the math she hated. The signs aligned with cruel precision. The body was failing faster than help could arrive. She looked at the woman, at the puppy, at the fence and the lights beyond it, and understood the terrible truth forming in her chest. This wasn't a rescue waiting to happen. It was a goodbye being negotiated. Emily leaned closer, voice breaking as she whispered comfort, knowing with sudden clarity that the woman had only minutes left to live. Emily's hand closed around the radio, and this time she didn't hesitate. She called emergency services first, then triggered the hospital emergency code that was never meant for places like this. Her voice carried urgency without apology, cutting through protocol like a blade through cloth. She gave coordinates: condition age unknown, critical dehydration, respiratory failure imminent. As the code echoed faintly from a distant speaker, Emily felt the invisible line snap inside her. Rules existed for order, for safety, for protection, but rules could not lie on the ground and wait to be seen. She knew exactly what she was doing. Activating that code from outside the perimeter would raise questions. Write her name into reports, invite meetings that ended with warnings or worse. She pictured the forms, the quiet disappointment, the reminder that procedures mattered. She also pictured the woman's eyes, glassy and fading, the shallow rise of her chest. Emily chose the consequence without drama. She knelt closer, shielding the woman from the wind, speaking steadily, keeping her awake with the sound of a human voice that refused to give up on her yet. Sirens cut through the morning within minutes, closer now, real. The puppy stiffened, then spun in tight circles, energy bursting into panic. He whined sharply, placing himself against the woman's ribs as if to hold her together. Emily laid a calming hand on his back, feeling his body shake beneath her palm. "Help is coming," she said, unsure who she meant it for. The woman's breathing rattled, then steadied for a moment, as if she understood the promise and was trying to meet it halfway. Paramedics moved fast, efficient and focused, their faces tightening as soon as they assessed her. One checked vitals, another prepared fluids, their clipped exchanges heavy with urgency. "She's crashing," someone said, not unkindly. "Critically close." The words landed with weight. Emily stepped back just enough to let them work, then leaned in again when the puppy refused to move, growling low, eyes wide and wet. It took careful hands and gentler voices to convince him that this was help, not harm. The stretcher appeared like an answer and a threat all at once. As they lifted the woman, her hand slipped from the puppy's fur. The sound he made then was raw and desperate, a small body unraveling. He jumped, claws scrabbling against metal, missing his mark. Emily caught him against her chest, feeling his heart hammer like it was trying to escape. "Easy," she whispered, though nothing about this was easy. The puppy trembled violently, gaze locked on the woman as if distance itself were dangerous. They moved toward the ambulance, doors yawning open, the interior bright and unforgiving. One paramedic shook his head gently. "He can't come," he said, already turning back to secure equipment. It was routine, automatic, the kind of sentence that ended conversations. Emily felt heat rise in her chest, a fierce clarity cutting through fear. She stepped forward, blocking the door with her body, the puppy clutched to her like a vow. "He stays," she said, not loud, not pleading, certain. They looked at her then, really looked, taking in the uniform, the radio still crackling, the resolve that had nowhere left to bend. Emily spoke quickly, laying out what mattered and what didn't. The woman was fragile, barely holding on. Separation would spike stress, destabilize her further. The puppy was a stabilizing presence, a constant, possibly the only one she had left. Emily accepted the risk aloud, the paperwork, the consequences. She would sign whatever was needed. She would answer for it later. This moment was not later. Seconds stretched, heavy and decisive. The puppy wriggled, desperate to reach the stretcher, his paws leaving damp prints on Emily's sleeve. Another paramedic hesitated, then nodded once, sharp and final. "Fine," he said, "but secure him." Relief hit Emily so hard her knees threatened to give. She passed the puppy forward, keeping a hand on him until the last possible second. He scrambled onto the bench, curling toward the woman, pressing close, shaking but present. The doors slammed shut with a sound that echoed like a verdict. Emily stood outside, breath ragged, watching the red lights flare to life. Through the small window, she saw the puppy lift his head, eyes wide but steady now, refusing to look away. The ambulance pulled forward, carrying rule-breaking hope, and a fragile bond that refused to be left behind. Emily didn't move as the vehicle disappeared around the corner, the space it left behind suddenly too quiet. Her hands were empty now, shaking slightly. The echo of the puppy's weight still warm against her arms. Somewhere inside the hospital, policies waited, along with supervisors and explanations. She would face them. But in this moment, standing in a forgotten place, Emily felt something steadier than fear. She had chosen presence over permission, loyalty over convenience, life over comfort. The path behind her remained cracked and overlooked, but it no longer felt invisible. Whatever happened next, the line she crossed could not be uncrossed. Somewhere down the road, an ambulance raced the clock, carrying a woman who had been unseen and a puppy who refused to let go. Emily breathed in, squared her shoulders, and followed, and knowing the rules would never feel the same again, not after this. She stepped forward, ready to answer whatever came next. The ambulance became a narrow world of motion and sound, every second folding in on itself as emergency treatment unfolded at speed. Hands moved with practiced urgency, securing lines, monitoring breaths, adjusting flow. The woman's body responded in fragile increments, numbers shifting just enough to keep hope alive. Emily stayed where she could, pressed against the wall, eyes tracking every movement, every flicker on the monitor. Exhaustion tugged at her muscles, but she refused it. Fatigue could wait. Presence could not. The paramedic nearest the stretcher called out updates in a calm voice that held the room together. Severe dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, critical but responding. Immediate intervention, he said, had made the difference. Emily felt the words settle into her chest, heavy and grounding. Not relief yet, but validation. The line between life and loss had been thin, almost invisible, and crossed at the exact moment she chose to listen instead of walk on. The puppy remained alert, unnaturally still for something so small. He sat braced against the stretcher, eyes fixed on the woman's face, tracking each rise and fall of her chest. When alarms chirped, he lifted his head. When hands reached in, he leaned closer, a quiet sentinel refusing to be distracted. Emily watched him with a soft ache. Vigilance, she realized, did not always look like action. Sometimes it was simply refusing to look away. They rolled through the hospital doors in a blur of light and voices, the stretcher handed off seamlessly to waiting staff. Emily followed until she was gently, firmly stopped. "We've got her," someone said, kind but decisive. The puppy let out a low sound, uncertain, then settled again when Emily crouched beside him. She whispered reassurance she barely felt herself, anchoring them both as the woman disappeared down the corridor. Hours passed in fragments. Emily sat in a quiet corner, back against a wall that hummed faintly with hospital life. Her legs ached. Her eyes burned. The puppy lay curled against her, never fully sleeping, ears twitching at every passing footstep. Staff moved around them with careful glances. A few paused, voices low, questions measured. Why was she involved? Why the animal? Emily answered simply, honestly, without defensiveness. She had seen someone in need. She had acted. No one argued outright. The questioning stayed soft, professional, edged with curiosity rather than accusation. Protocols were mentioned. Lines were noted. But beneath it all was an unspoken acknowledgement. The woman was alive. Barely but undeniably. And that fact shifted the weight of every concern. Emily felt the quiet tension ease, replaced by something like respect, though no one named it. When a doctor finally approached, his expression held the gravity of someone who understood margins. He explained the damage done by neglect, by time, by thirst. He also explained what had saved her: immediate fluids, early recognition, the decision not to delay. If she'd come in even minutes later, he said, trailing off. Emily nodded. She didn't need the rest of the sentence. She carried it already. The puppy lifted his head as if he sensed the turning tide. His tail thumped once, tentative. Emily pressed her forehead briefly to the wall, letting the moment pass through her. She felt emptied and full at once, wrung out but steady. This was why she stayed in medicine, she thought, not for outcomes guaranteed, but for chances claimed. Days blurred together after that. Emily returned to shifts, to routine, to the steady rhythm that usually kept emotion at bay. Yet she checked the board more often than she admitted, scanning for updates, listening for names. The puppy waited with her during breaks, patient, watchful, as if time itself had taught him restraint. They were allowed brief visits, quiet and controlled. The woman did not wake, but her breathing deepened, her color improved, small victories accumulating without ceremony. On the fourth morning, Emily stood at the doorway hesitant to hope. The room was hushed, sunlight filtering through blinds. The puppy sat at her feet, suddenly alert. The woman's fingers twitched. Then slowly, deliberately, her eyes opened. They searched, unfocused at first, then steadied on the familiar shape beside her. The puppy rose, tail trembling, a soft sound escaping his chest. Emily felt her breath catch as the moment unfolded, fragile and profound. The thin line had held, and on the other side of it, a woman finally returned to herself, because someone had listened when it mattered most. The woman returned to the world in pieces, not all at once. First came breath, deeper now, steadier, like she was relearning how to trust air. Then her fingers moved, slow and uncertain, tracing the blanket as if confirming it was real. Her eyes fluttered open and closed, light startling her each time, until finally they stayed open long enough to focus. Emily stood close but not looming, careful with her presence, aware that waking could be as frightening as fading. Her body was weak in ways that could be measured, charted, explained. Every movement cost her effort. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, thin as paper. Yet there was clarity in her gaze that surprised everyone in the room. She knew where she was. She knew who stood beside her. And most of all, she knew who lay curled against her side, small and warm, eyes locked on her face with unwavering devotion. The puppy lifted his head the moment she stirred, tail trembling as if unsure whether joy was allowed yet. He did not jump or bark. He simply watched, breath held, ready for whatever she needed. When her hand shifted, he nudged it gently with his nose, a silent question. The woman's lips curved into the faintest smile, fragile but unmistakable. Emily felt something loosen in her chest at the sight. It took time for the woman to speak, and no one rushed her. Each sentence arrived carefully, carried on shallow breaths. She explained that she hadn't always been alone, that once she'd had a small room and a life that fit inside it. Circumstances shifted, as they sometimes do, quietly at first and then all at once. She spoke without bitterness, only fact, as if hardship had become a language she no longer needed to defend. Her voice steadied when she spoke of the puppy. Days earlier she said she'd found him trembling beneath a bench, ribs showing, eyes too big for his face. He hadn't run. He'd looked at her like she was the answer to a question he didn't know how to ask. She had shared what little water she had, torn bread into smaller pieces, coaxed him closer. He followed me, she whispered, a hint of wonder threading through the exhaustion. Like he chose me. She paused then, gathering strength, her hand resting on the puppy's back. Emily watched the rhythm of her breathing, ready to intervene if it faltered. But the woman went on, determined. She said she had tried to find help, walking farther than she should have, refusing to leave him behind. The hospital lights had been visible through the fence, close enough to feel possible. She had believed she could make it if she just kept moving. She never did. Her legs had given out, her vision narrowing, the world dimming at the edges. She remembered falling, the ground cold beneath her cheek. She remembered fear then, not of dying, but of what would happen to the small life beside her. Her voice cracked as she described trying to push him away, urging him to run, to save himself. He hadn't listened. He stayed, she said simply. The puppy pressed closer as if confirming the truth of it. He had stayed through the long hours, through thirst and cold and fading consciousness. He had barked when footsteps passed too far away. He had curled against her chest at night, sharing warmth he could barely spare. He had guarded her with a loyalty that did not calculate odds or outcomes. Emily felt tears gather, uninvited and unstoppable. The woman turned her head slightly, eyes meeting Emily's. "I saved him first," she whispered. "But he saved me longer." The words settled into the room, heavy with meaning. Rescue had not been a single act. It had been an exchange, a quiet reversal that unfolded over days no one witnessed. Strength had shifted hands without ceremony. Emily understood then what she had sensed from the beginning. The puppy had not been panicked for himself. His fear had never been about hunger or danger or separation. It had been about losing her. Every frantic movement, every watchful hour had been an act of protection, not desperation. He had been pleading for her life, not his own. The realization struck with quiet force. Emily looked at the puppy, really looked, and saw not a stray but a guardian. She saw a creature who had chosen responsibility over survival, presence over escape. In a world that often looked past the vulnerable, he had refused to look away. The woman's eyes grew heavy as the truth left her, fatigue reclaiming ground it had temporarily surrendered. Emily adjusted the blanket, murmuring reassurance, promising rest. The puppy settled beside her again, vigilance softening but never disappearing. As the room grew still, Emily stood back, heart full and aching. Outside, life moved on at its usual pace, unaware of the story whispered within these walls. Inside, Emily held the final realization close. The puppy had never pleaded for himself. He had already given everything he had, long before anyone noticed. Recovery did not arrive like a sunrise. It came the way weather changes do, quietly, almost unnoticed, until suddenly the air felt different. Emily stayed close through it all, checking in between shifts, lingering longer than required, learning the woman's rhythms as carefully as she learned her vitals. Progress showed itself in small mercies, stronger breaths, clearer eyes, a voice that carried farther each day. Nothing dramatic, everything precious. The puppy never left her side. When nurses adjusted IV lines or doctors asked questions, he shifted just enough to make room, then settled again, watchful but calm. Gone was the frantic trembling of those first hours. In its place was a steady presence, as if he understood the danger had passed but the duty had not. He slept lightly, woke easily, and followed the woman's every movement with quiet attention. Emily noticed how his breathing synced with hers, how his body curved protectively without tension. This was not fear anymore. This was belonging. At first, staff moved around him cautiously, habits slow to change. Policies still existed, concerns still hovered. But days have a way of teaching what arguments cannot. The puppy caused no trouble. He did not bark or lunge or interfere. He seemed to understand the boundaries of the room instinctively, respecting hands that reached in to heal. Gradually, suspicion softened into acceptance. Smiles appeared. Someone brought a small bowl of water without being asked. Another nurse scratched behind his ears while charting. Surprised by how grounding the simple act felt, Emily watched the shift with a quiet sense of awe. The same hospital that had nearly missed them now made space. The same system that questioned her choices now adjusted to what was undeniably right. She thought often about how close both lives had come to slipping away unnoticed, about the fragile margin where everything might have ended differently. A wrong turn, a longer pause, a moment of looking down instead of around. In quieter moments, Emily replayed the contrast that haunted her. The ignored cries of a place no one checked. The answered ones that echoed once someone listened. She had spent years believing that effort always led to impact, that systems caught what mattered. Now she knew better. Sometimes survival depended on a single person refusing to walk past discomfort. Sometimes it depended on a puppy staying when every instinct should have told him to run. The woman grew stronger, her smile easier, her gratitude deep but never loud. She spoke more about her life, about small joys she once took for granted. She thanked Emily often, but Emily always redirected it, pointing to the puppy, to timing, to chance. Inside, she carried the weight of knowing how rare such chances were. She wondered how many others had not been so lucky, how many corners remained unseen. As discharge discussions began, a quiet tension settled into Emily's chest. Plans were made, options weighed, futures sketched in careful language. None of them answered the question that lingered unspoken. Emily felt it pressing closer each day, unavoidable now. Bonds forged in survival did not dissolve easily. She looked at the woman resting peacefully, the puppy curled at her side, and understood that whatever choice came next would not be small. One evening, as the lights dimmed and the room settled into hush, Emily stood at the doorway longer than usual. The puppy lifted his head, meeting her gaze, eyes steady and trusting. In that look was a question, and a faith that unsettled her. Emily knew then that she stood on the edge of a decision that would alter the shape of her life. Some lines, once crossed, never fade, and some bonds, once formed, ask to be honored forever. The paperwork was simple, almost disappointingly so. A few signatures, a quiet conversation, a nod of approval from someone who had watched the story unfold and no longer questioned it. Emily held the clipboard with steady hands, though something inside her felt like it was shifting into place. When she finished, The puppy looked up at her, tail giving a cautious wag, as if waiting for confirmation that the world had truly changed. Emily crouched and rested her forehead against his. "You're mine now," she whispered. He answered by leaning into her, a decision already made. Adopting him did not feel like acquiring something new. It felt like acknowledging what had already been true for days. He followed her through the halls with quiet confidence, no longer anxious, no longer searching. His presence settled her in ways she hadn't known she needed. When she returned to the woman's room, the puppy moved ahead of her, familiar and welcome, hopping gently onto the bed without hesitation. The woman laughed softly, a sound that still surprised her, and reached for him with hands that were stronger now. Emily committed herself to the woman's recovery with the same steadiness. She coordinated appointments, checked in between shifts, listened when the woman spoke of fears that surfaced only at night. Healing, she learned, was not linear. Strength returned unevenly, confidence lagged behind progress. Emily stayed anyway. She stayed because leaving no longer felt like an option. Presence had become a promise she could not break. Something subtle began to change among the three of them. Laughter came more easily. Silence no longer carried weight. The puppy slept deeply now, sprawled and unguarded, as if his watch had finally ended. The woman's eyes held more light, less apology. Emily felt herself soften too, layers of guarded professionalism giving way to something warmer, more human. Emotional healing did not announce itself with milestones. It revealed itself in ease. Emily noticed how kindness moved in circles. What she had offered without expectation returned to her in unexpected forms. In the puppy's trust. In the woman's resilience. In the quiet moments where she felt less alone than she had in years. She had entered this story believing she was giving something away. Instead, she found herself receiving, again and again, in ways that could not be charted or quantified. The hospital itself began to feel different. The hallways no longer blurred into routine. She saw faces instead of roles, pauses instead of procedures. Corners she once passed without thought now carried weight. She slowed down, listened longer, noticed what others overlooked. The building had not changed, but she had. It was no longer just a place of endings and beginnings. It was a place of choices. On her last visit before the woman's transfer to a longer-term facility, Emily lingered by the window. The puppy rested at her feet, the woman beside him peaceful. "You didn't just save us," the woman said quietly. Emily shook her head, ready with her usual deflection, but the woman continued. "You stayed." The word settled deep, undeniable. As Emily walked out that evening, leash in hand, she understood something with sudden clarity. This story had never been about rescue alone. It was about listening, about choosing to remain when it would have been easier to move on. It was about the quiet power of staying, and how, sometimes, that choice changes everything. In the days that followed, Emily found herself replaying the story from angles she hadn't considered before. Not the dramatic moments, not the urgency or the breaking of rules, but the quieter truths threaded beneath it all. She thought about the places people didn't look, the pauses where suffering learned to stay silent because noise had failed it too many times. She thought about how easily lives could exist beside help without ever touching it, separated not by distance but by attention. The puppy had not exposed a lie in the system, not really. There had been no grand failure, no single villain to blame. What he revealed was more unsettling and more human. Compassion had not vanished. It had thinned. It had grown quiet. It had learned to wait in corners, in shadows, in places no one checked anymore. The puppy had not shouted that truth. He had lived it. Emily understood now that his presence had been a kind of testimony. He had stood watch over someone the world had stopped seeing, not because he expected reward, but because staying felt right. He did not calculate risk or weigh outcomes. He did not demand recognition. He simply refused to abandon what mattered. In doing so, he proved something Emily had almost forgotten in her years of triage and timelines. Care does not always rush in. Sometimes it endures. She noticed how often she had equated urgency with value. Alarms, sirens, raised voices. Those were the things she was trained to respond to. But the woman had not cried out. The puppy had not begged for himself. Their suffering had been quiet, disciplined by neglect into stillness. And yet it had been no less real. The realization humbled her in ways no reprimand ever could. Emily began to see silent guardians everywhere. In the nurse who lingered an extra minute with a patient who couldn't speak. In the orderly who adjusted a blanket without being asked. In herself, when she chose to listen past fatigue. These acts did not fix the world. They did not erase systemic gaps or undo long histories of being overlooked. But they mattered. They accumulated. They kept something human alive. The puppy slept at her feet now as she reflected, stretched out and unburdened, his work done for the moment. He had survived hunger, cold, and uncertainty without losing his capacity to care. That, Emily realized, was the miracle. Not that he endured hardship, but that hardship had not hardened him. Compassion had survived the cycle of neglect, intact and transferable, waiting only for someone to notice. Faith returned to Emily quietly without ceremony. Not faith in institutions or guarantees, but in choice. In the small, deliberate decisions people make when no one is watching. She believed again in the power of noticing, of stopping, of staying. These were not heroic acts. They were human ones. And they were enough to tip the balance when the line between life and loss grew thin. She thought of the woman, rebuilding strength one careful step at a time. She thought of herself, altered in ways she could not fully articulate. This story had braided their lives together without permission, without planning. It had asked something of each of them and given something back, unevenly but sincerely. No one emerged unchanged. That, Emily suspected, was the point. As evening settled, Emily watched the hospital lights flicker on, softer now, less blinding. She no longer saw them as promises or failures, but as possibilities dependent on choice. Help did not always arrive loudly, with flashing signals and certainty. Sometimes it waited. Sometimes it watched. Sometimes it lay beside someone on cold ground and refused to leave. Emily bent and rested a hand on the puppy's back, feeling the steady warmth there. She understood at last what he had proven all along. Compassion does not disappear just because it is ignored. It adapts. It waits patiently. And when someone finally chooses to listen, it rises, quietly but unmistakably, ready to save what it can.